evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepytimetales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind plagued with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve well rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Before we get on with the show, I'd like to take a couple of minutes of your time. I talk every week how the show is brought to you with direct support from listeners like you, mostly on Patreon, but also sometimes on Buy Me a Coffee or the PayPal tip jar on the website. There have been some lean times in the last couple of years, and this show would not have survived without that support. I'm very grateful to those listeners who've had the means to help fund the show, to keep it going, and to help me to reach new audiences. So if you're making use of Sleepytimetales regularly to help you to deal with sleeplessness, and you have the urge to support the show, and most importantly, if you have the means, please check out patreon.com/sleepytimetales. Go to the link in the show notes or from the website to get access to those bonus episodes, as well as simply to keep the show going out to those who need it. While I said I wouldn't have been able to keep the show going without support, there have been a lot of hard times for a lot of people lately, and I've lost a few patrons recently because they just can't afford to keep the backing. Now, of course, I wouldn't want anyone to back the podcast if they absolutely can't afford it. So I wish them all the best. But now is a particularly good time to sign up to help have a huge impact on the show. In fact, I'm going to offer a little bit of an incentive. Make it an even better time to sign up. If I can get the show to $100 a month on the Patreon, I will do a monthly bonus poetry reading, which will go out to all patrons at all levels. So if you'd like me reading some poetry to you, you can back at any level to help hit that goal. And of course, that reading will be in addition to the already existing early releases, special edits, and already existing minisodes and megasodes that go out depending on the level at which you sign up. But of course, if you're more inclined to make a once-off contribution and there's no way I can tempt you into backing me on a monthly basis, you can take a look at buymeacoffee.com/sleepytimetales, also linked in the show notes, and there you can help out the show without needing to make a larger commitment. But there's another huge way you can help the show, and that's to simply to spread the word. If there is someone in your life who you think will benefit from listening to Sleepytimetales, just let them know. If you recommend the show on social media, make sure to tag me in so that I know and I can thank you. That's at Sleepytimetales on Instagram and Twitter. And last but not least, I've got to give a shout out to the music, which is Sweet Night and Friends by Kumiku. Their music is available on their website at loyaltyfreakmusic.com, and I've linked their website in the show notes as they've got some very cool stuff released under various names that I recommend checking out. And if you're someone who does YouTube videos or podcasts or something of your own, all this stuff is available on Creative Commons, mostly for public domain use, and is very cool and suitable for a lot of purposes, so definitely worth a check. And I've gone on a little bit long. Thank you very much for your patience. Let's get back to the show. So what exactly is Sleepytimetales? What is it for? This strange idea, this podcast that you're supposed to fall asleep to. But lack of sleep is a health crisis in the 21st century, and this is a podcast that is intended to help those that it can to get a restful night. Do you find yourself lying awake at night, with your mind spinning and your emotions in turmoil with the anxieties of 21st century life? Do you wake up in the middle of the night and find yourself not quite able to doze back off at 3 a.m.? I'm here to help. My name is Dave, and I'm your narrator, here to help you into a restful night. Sleepytimetales is intended to be used as a distraction to what keeps you awake at night, or maybe sometimes simply background noise or even just company. That's why I make these episodes quite long, so that I'm here for you, without any pressure of the end coming. Now, as far as I know, there's a couple of different ways to engage with the show. The primary thing for me, because it's how I engage with the sleep podcasts that I listen to, is to give you something to focus on, a story or an event that lets you keep your mind on a specific point, to stop it from spinning out into stress and anxieties, to focus just enough not to resist the embrace of a night's sleep when it comes for you. But some people need something a little bit different. Sometimes they just need some background, some kind of white noise, maybe the wind in the trees or the ocean or some boring dude just droning on, telling you a story. But however you're engaging with the show, I think the most important thing is you don't try to force the sleep. Just relax and lean into it and allow the need for sleep to come for you. Now, obviously, I'm hoping that you'll sleep before I get to the end of the episode, but it is important that you don't feel pressurized. This may not work on your first night. In fact, I doubt it will work on your first night. It'll probably take you a couple of nights, probably 2 or 3, to get used to the idea of the strangeness of this, to get used to my voice. And it's also possible, especially early on, that one episode just isn't quite long enough. Or maybe the problem isn't so much going to sleep. Maybe you wake up in the middle of the night and find yourself staring at the ceiling and not quite even realizing that you're doing it. In that case, what I recommend you do is download a few episodes of the podcast, do a playlist with them, and then when you go to sleep, start it up so that when you wake up in the middle of the night, it's still going. And if you're listening on earbuds, then you can just pop them back in and go back to sleep again. Or a smart speaker or something like that will just carry on telling you the story until you go back to sleep. You can even do a similar thing if you're one of those people that wakes up just before the alarm goes. This is something I've actually had people reach out and thank me for suggesting. If you wake up 30 minutes before the alarm or 60 minutes before the alarm, just, again, pop your earbuds back in and go back to sleep. Because there's something deeply satisfying about that, just allowing yourself complete relaxation right before the alarm. That's restful in a whole new way. But again, whether it's going to sleep or staying asleep or going back to sleep, I do recommend you just try to relax. If you're new to the show and prone to late nights lying staring at the ceiling, this will probably seem strange to you. So just give it a chance. Because I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So if you're still with me, thank you for staying. If you're already asleep, we'll chat again soon. And of course, you aren't hearing me, except maybe in a dream. The Secret Garden by Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 5. The Cry in the Corridor. At first, each day which passed by for Mary Lennox was exactly like the others. Every morning she awoke in her tapestried room and found Martha kneeling upon the hearth building her fire. Every morning she ate her breakfast in the nursery, which had nothing amusing in it. And after each breakfast she gazed out of the window across to the huge moor, which seemed to spread out on all sides and climb up to the sky. And after she had stared for a while, she realized that if she did not go out, she would have to stay in and do nothing. And so she went out. She did not know that this was the best thing she could have done, and she did not know that, when she began to walk quickly, or even run along the paths and down the avenue, she was stirring her slow blood and making herself stronger by fighting with the wind which swept down from the moor. She ran only to make herself warm, and she hated the wind which rushed at her face and roared, and held her back as if it were some giant she could not see. But the big breaths of rough, fresh air blown over the heather filled her lungs with something which was good for her whole thin body, and whipped some red colour into her cheeks, and brightened her dull eyes, when she did not know anything about it. But after a few days spent almost entirely out of doors, she wakened one morning knowing what it was to be hungry. And when she sat down to her breakfast, she did not glance disdainfully at her porridge and push it away, but took up her spoon and began to eat it, and went on eating it, until her bowl was empty. "They got on well enough with that this morning, didn't they?" said Martha. "It tastes nice today," said Mary, feeling a little surprised herself. "It's the air of the moor that's given you a stomach for the victuals," answered Martha. "It's lucky for thee that there's got victuals as well as appetite. There's been 12 in our cottage as had the stomach and nothing to put in it. You go and play in you out of doors every day and you'll get some flesh on your bones and you won't be so yellow." "I don't play," said Mary. "There's nothing to play with." "Nothing to play with," exclaimed Martha. "Our children plays with sticks and stones. They just runs about and shouts and looks at things." Mary did not shout, but she looked at things. There was nothing else to do. She walked round and round the gardens and wandered about the paths in the park. Sometimes she looked for Ben Weatherstaff, but though several times she saw him at work, he was too busy to look at her or was too surly. Once when she was walking toward him, he picked up his spade and turned away as if he did it on purpose. One place she went to oftener than to any other. It was the long walk outside the gardens with the walls around them. There were bare flower beds on either side of it, and against the walls ivy grew thickly. There was one part of the wall where the creeping dark green leaves were more bushy than elsewhere. It seemed as if for a long time that part had been neglected. The rest of it had been clipped and made to look neat, but at this lower end of the walk it had not been trimmed at all. A few days after she had talked to Ben Weatherstaff, Mary stopped to notice this and wondered why it was so. She had just paused and was looking up at a long spray of ivy swinging in the wind, when she saw a gleam of scarlet and heard a brilliant chirp. And there, on the top of the wall, perched Ben Weatherstaff's robin redbreast, tilting forward to look at her with his small head on one side. "Oh," she cried out. "Is it you? Is it you?" And it did not seem at all queer to her that she spoke to him, as if she was sure he would understand and answer her. He did answer. He twittered and chirped and hopped along the wall as if he were telling her all sorts of things. It seemed to Mistress Mary as if she understood him too, though she was not speaking in words. It was as if he said, "Good morning. Isn't the wind nice? Isn't the sun nice? Isn't everything nice? Let us both chirp and hop and twitter. Come on, come on." Mary began to laugh, and as he hopped and took little flights along the wall, she ran after him. Poor little, thin, sallow, ugly Mary. She actually looked almost pretty for a moment. I like you, she cried out, pattering down the sidewalk. And she chirped and tried to whistle, which last she did not know how to do in the least. But the robin seemed to be quite satisfied and chirped and whistled back at her. At last he spread his wings and made a darting flight to the top of a tree where he perched and sang loudly. That reminded Mary of the first time she had seen him. He had been swinging on a treetop then, and she had been standing in the orchard. Now she was on the other side of the orchard and standing in the path outside a wall, much lower down, and there was the same tree inside. "It's in the garden no one can go into," she said to herself. "It's the garden without a door. He lives in there. How I wish I could see what it is like." She ran up the walk to the green door she had entered the first morning. Then she ran down the path through the other door, and then into the orchard. And when she stood and looked up, there was the tree on the other side of the wall. And there was the robin just finishing his song and beginning to preen his feathers with his beak. "It is the garden," she said. "I'm sure it is." She walked round and looked closely at that side of the orchard wall, but she only found what she had found before, that there was no door in it. Then she ran through the kitchen gardens again and out into the walk outside the long ivy-covered wall, and she walked to the end of it and looked at it, but there was no door. And then she walked to the other end, looking again, but there was no door. "It's very queer," she said. "Ben Weatherstaff said there was no door, and there is no door. But there must have been one 10 years ago because Mr. Craven buried the key." This gave her so much to think of that she began to be quite interested, and feel that she was not sorry that she had come to Misselthwaite Manor. In India she had always felt hot and too languid to care much about anything. The fact was that the fresh wind from the moor had begun to blow the cobwebs out of her young brain, and to waken her up a little. She stayed out of doors nearly all day, and when she sat down to her supper at night she felt hungry and drowsy and comfortable. She did not feel cross when Martha chatted away. She felt as if she rather liked to hear her, and at last she thought she would ask her a question. She asked it after she had finished her supper and had sat down on the hearthrug before the fire. "Why did Mr. Craven hate the garden?" she said. She had made Martha stay with her, and Martha had not objected at all. She was very young and used to a crowded cottage full of brothers and sisters, and she had found it dull in the great servants' hall downstairs, where the footmen and upper housemaids made fun of her Yorkshire speech, and looked upon her as a common little thing, and sat and whispered among themselves. Martha liked to talk, but the strange child who had lived in India was novelty enough to attract her. She sat down on the hearth herself without waiting to be asked. "Art thou thinking about that garden yet?" she said. "I knew the word. That was just the way with me when I first heard about it." "Why did he hate it?" Mary persisted. Martha tucked her feet under her and made herself quite comfortable. "Listen to the wind wuthering round the house," she said. "You could bear stand up on the moor if you're out on it tonight." Mary did not know what wuthering meant until she listened, and then she understood. It must mean that hollow, shuddering sort of roar which rushed around and round the house as if the giant no one could see were buffeting it, and beating at the walls and windows to try to break in. But one knew he could not get in, and somehow it made one feel very safe and warm inside a room with a red coal fire. "But why did he hate it so?" she asked, after she had listened. She intended to know if Martha did. Then Martha gave up her store of knowledge. "Mind," she said, "Mrs. Medlock said it's not to be talked about. There's lots of things in this place that's not to be talked over. That's Mr. Craven's orders. His trouble's a nun servant's business, he says. But for the garden, he wouldn't be like he is." It was Mrs. Craven's garden that she had made when first they were married, and she just loved it. And they used to tend the flowers themselves, and none of the gardeners were ever let to go in. Him and her used to go in and shut the door and stay there hours and hours, reading and talking. And she was just a bit of a girl, and there was an old tree with a branch bent like a seat on it. And she made roses grow over it, and she used to sit there. But one day, when she was sitting there, the branch broke and she fell on the ground, and was hurt so bad the next day she died. The doctors thought he'd go out of his mind and die too. That's why he hates it. No one's ever gone in since, and he won't let anyone talk about it. Mary did not ask any more questions. She looked at the red fire and listened to the wind wuthering. It seemed to be wuthering louder than ever. At that moment, a very good thing was happening to her. 4 good things had happened to her, in fact, since she came to Misselthwaite Manor. She felt as if she had understood a robin, and that he understood her. She had run in the wind until her blood had grown warm. She had been healthily hungry for the first time in her life. And she had found out what it was to be sorry for someone. But as she was listening to the wind, she began to listen to something else. She did not know what it was, because at first she could scarcely distinguish it from the wind itself. It was a curious sound. It seemed almost as if a child were crying somewhere. Sometimes the wind sounded rather like a child crying, but presently Mistress Mary felt quite sure the sound was inside the house, not outside it. It was far away, but it was inside. She turned round and looked at Martha. "Do you hear anyone crying?" she said. Martha looked suddenly confused. "No," she answered. "It's the wind. Sometimes it sounds like if someone were lost on the moor in Wayland. It's got all sorts of sounds." "But listen," said Mary. "It's in the house, down one of those long corridors." And at that very moment a door must have been opened somewhere downstairs, for a great rushing draught blew along the passage, and the door of the room they were in was blown open with a crash. And as they both jumped to their feet, the light was blown out, and the crying sound was swept down the far corridor, so that it was to be heard more plainly than ever. "There," said Mary, "I told you so. It is someone crying, and it isn't a grown-up person." Martha ran and shut the door and turned the key. But before she did it, they both heard the sound of a door in some far passage shutting with a bang. And then everything was quiet, for even the wind ceased wuthering for a few moments. "It was the wind," said Martha stubbornly. "And if it wasn't, it was little Betty Butterworth, the scullery maid. She's had a toothache all day." But something troubled and awkward in her manner made Mistress Mary stare very hard at her. She did not believe she was speaking the truth. Chapter 6. There was someone crying. There was. The next day the rain poured down in torrents again, and when Mary looked out of her window, the Moya was almost hidden by grey mist and cloud. There could be no going out today. "What do you do in your cottage when it rains like this?" she asked Martha. "Try to keep out from under each other's feet mostly," Martha answered. "There does seem to be a lot of us then. Mother's a good-tempered woman, but she gets a fair bit moithered. The biggest one goes out in the cowshed and plays there. Dickon, he doesn't mind getting in the wet. He goes out just the same as if the sun was shining. He says he sees things on rainy days as don't show when it's fair weather." He once found a little fox cub halfway drowned in its hole, and he brought it home in the bosom of his shirt to keep it warm. Its mother had been killed nearby, and the hole was swum out, and the rest of the litter was dead. He's got it at home now. He found a half-drowned young crow another time, and he brought that home too, and tamed it. It's named Soot because it's so black, and it hops and flies about with him everywhere. The time had come when Mary had forgotten to resent Martha's familiar talk. She had even begun to find it interesting and to be sorry when she stopped or went away. The story she had been told by her ayah when she lived in India had been quite unlike those Martha had to tell about the moorland cottage, which held 14 people who lived in 4 little rooms, and never had quite enough to eat. The children seemed to tumble about and amuse themselves like a litter of rough, good-natured collie puppies. Mary was most attracted by the mother and Dickon. When Martha told stories of what Mother did or said, they always sound comfortable. "If I had a raven or a fox cub, I would play with it," said Mary, "but I have nothing." Martha looked perplexed. "Can they knit?" she asked. "No," answered Mary. "Can they sew?" "No." "Can they read?" "Yes." "Then why doesn't they read something or learn a bit of spelling? They're still old enough to be learning our books a good bit now." "I haven't any books," said Mary. "Those I had were left in India." "That's a pity," said Martha. "If Mrs. Medlock had let thee go into the library, there's thousands of books there." Mary did not ask where the library was, because she was suddenly inspired by a new idea. She had made up her mind to go and find it herself. She was not troubled about Mrs. Medlock. Mrs. Medlock always seemed to be in her comfortable housekeeper's sitting room downstairs. In this queer place one scarcely ever saw anyone at all. In fact, there was no one to see but the servants, and when their master was away they lived a luxurious life below stairs, where there was a huge kitchen hung about with shining brass and pewter, and a large servants' hall where there were 4 or 5 abundant meals eaten every day, and where a great deal of lively romping went on when Mrs. Medlock was out of the way. Mary's meals were served regularly, and Martha waited on her. But no one had troubled themselves about her in the least. Mrs. Medlock came and looked at her every day or two, but no one inquired what she did or told her what to do. She supposed that perhaps this was the English way of treating children. In India she had always been attended to by her ayah, who had followed her about and waited on her hand and foot. She had often been tired of her company. Now she was followed by nobody and was learning to dress herself, because Martha looked as though she thought it was silly and stupid when she wanted to have things handed to her and put on. "Hasn't they got any sense?" she said once, when Mary had stood waiting for her to put on her gloves for her. "Our Susan Ann is twice as sharp as thee, and she's only 4 years old. Sometimes they looks fair soft in the head." Mary had worn her contrary scowl for an hour after that, but it made her think several entirely new things. She stood at the window for about 10 minutes this morning after Martha had swept up the hearth for the last time and gone downstairs. She was thinking over the new idea which had come to her when she had heard of the library. She did not care very much about the library itself, because she had read very few books. But to hear of it brought back to her mind the 100 rooms with closed doors. She wondered if they were really all locked, and what she would find if she could get into any of them. Were there 100 really? Why shouldn't she go and see how many doors she could count? It would be something to do on this morning when she couldn't go out. She had never been taught to ask permission to do things, and she knew nothing at all about authority, so she would not have thought it necessary to ask Mrs. Medlock if she might walk about the house, even if she had seen her. She opened the door of the room and went into the corridor, and then she began her wanderings. It was a long corridor, and it branched into other corridors, and it led up short flights of steps which mounted to others again. There were doors, and there were pictures on the walls. Sometimes there were pictures of dark, curious landscapes, but oftenest there were portraits of men and women in queer, grand costumes made of satin and velvet. She found herself in one long gallery whose walls were covered with these portraits. She had never thought there could be so many in any house. She walked slowly down this place and stared at the faces which also seemed to stare at her. She felt as if they were wondering what a little girl from India was doing in their house. Some were pictures of children. Little girls in thick satin frocks which reached to their feet and stood out about them, and boys with puffed sleeves and lace collars and long hair, or with big ruffs around their necks. She always stopped to look at the children and wonder what their names were, and where they had gone, and why they wore such odd clothes. There was a stiff, plain little girl, rather like herself. She wore a green brocade dress and held a green parrot on her finger. Her eyes had a sharp, curious look. "Where do you live now?" said Mary aloud to her. "I wish you were here." Surely no other little girl ever spent such a queer morning. It seemed as if there were no one in all the huge rambling house but her own small self, wandering about upstairs and down, through narrow passages and wide ones where it seemed to her that no one but herself had ever walked. Since so many rooms had been built, people must have lived in them, but it all seemed so empty that she could not quite believe it true. It was not until she climbed to the second floor that she thought of turning the handle of a door. All the doors were shut, as Mrs. Medlock had said they were, but at last she put her hand on the handle of one of them and turned it. She was almost frightened for a moment when she found that it turned without difficulty, and that when she pushed upon the door itself, it slowly and heavily opened. It was a massive door and opened into a big bedroom. There were embroidered hangings on the wall, and inlaid furniture such as she had seen in India stood about the room. A broad window with leaded panes looked out upon the moor, and over the mantel was another portrait of the stiff, plain little girl who seemed to stare at her more curiously than ever. "Perhaps she slept here once," said Mary. "She stares at me so that she makes me feel queer." After that she opened more doors and more. She saw so many rooms that she became quite tired, and began to think that there must be 100, though she had not counted them. In all of them were old pictures or old tapestries with strange scenes worked upon them. There were curious pieces of furniture and curious ornaments in nearly all of them. In one room, which looked like a lady's sitting room, the hangings were all embroidered velvet. and in a cabinet were about 100 little elephants made of ivory. They were of different sizes, and some had their mahots or palanquins on their backs. Some were much larger than the others, and some were so tiny that they seemed only babies. Mary had seen carved ivory in India, and she knew all about elephants. She opened the door of the cabinet and stood on a footstool, and played with these for quite a long time. When she got tired, she set the elephants in order and shut the door of the cabinet. In all her wanderings through the long corridors and the empty rooms, she had seen nothing alive. But in this room she saw something. Just after she had closed the cabinet door, she heard a tiny rustling sound. It made her jump and look around at the sofa by the fireplace, from which it seemed to come. In the corner of the sofa there was a cushion, and in the velvet which covered it there was a hole, and out of the hole peeped a tiny head with a pair of frightened eyes in it. Mary crept softly across the room to look. The bright eyes had belonged to a little grey mouse, and the mouse had eaten a hole into the cushion and made a comfortable nest there. 6 baby mice were cuddled up asleep near her. If there was no one else alive in the 100 rooms, there were 7 mice who did not look lonely at all. If they wouldn't be so frightened, I would take them back with me, said Mary. She had wandered about long enough to feel too tired to wander any further, and she turned back. 2 or 3 times she lost her way by turning down the wrong corridor, and was obliged to ramble up and down until she found the right one. But at last she reached her own floor again, though she was some distance from her own room and did not know exactly where she was. I believe I must have taken a wrong turning again, she said, standing still at what seemed the end of a short passage with a tapestry on the wall. I don't know which way to go. How still everything is. It was while she was standing here, and just after she had said this, that the stillness was broken by a sound. It was another cry, but not quite like the one she had heard last night. It was only a short one, a fretful, childish whine muffled by passing through walls. It's nearer than it was, said Mary, her heart beating rather faster. And it is crying. She put her hand accidentally upon the tapestry near her, and then sprang back, feeling quite startled. The tapestry was the covering of a door which fell open and showed her that there was another part of the corridor behind it, and Mrs. Medlock was coming up it with her bunch of keys in her hand, and a very cross look on her face. "What are you doing here?" she said, and she took Mary by the arm and pulled her away. "What did I tell you?" "I turned around the wrong corner," explained Mary. "I didn't know which way to go, and I heard someone crying." She quite hated Mrs. Medlock at the moment, but she hated her more the next. "You didn't hear anything of the sort," said the housekeeper. "You come along back to your own nursery, or I'll box your ears." She took her by the arm and half pushed, half pulled her up one passage and down another until she pushed her in at her door of her own room. "Now," she said, "you stay where you're told to stay, or you'll find yourself locked up. The master had better get you a governess, same as he said he would. You're one that needs someone to look sharp after you. I've got enough to do." She went out of the room and slammed the door after her, and Mary went and sat on the hearthrug, pale with rage. She did not cry, but she ground her teeth. There was someone crying. There was, There was, she said to herself. She had heard it twice now, and sometimes she would find out. She had found out a great deal this morning. She felt as if she had been on a long journey, and at any rate she had had something to amuse her all the time. And she had played with the ivory elephants, and she had seen the grey mouse and its babies in their nest in the velvet cushion. Chapter 7. The Key to the Garden. 2 days after this, when Mary opened her eyes, she sat upright in bed immediately and called to Martha. "Look at the Moya! Look at the Moya!" The rainstorm had ended, and the grey mist and clouds had been swept away in the night by the wind. The wind itself had ceased, and a brilliant, deep blue sky arched over the moorland. Never, never had Mary dreamed of a sky so blue. In India, skies were hot and blazing. This was of a deep, cool blue, which almost seemed to sparkle like the waters of some lovely, bottomless lake. And here and there, high, high in the arched blueness, floated small clouds of snow-white fleece. The far-reaching world of the moor itself looked softly blue instead of gloomy purple-black or awful, dreary grey. "Aye," said Martha with a cheerful grin. "The storm's over for a bit. It does like this at the time of year. Goes off in a night like it was pretending it had never been here and never meant to come again. That's because the springtime's on its way. It's a long way off yet, but it's coming." "I thought perhaps it always rained or looked dark in England," Mary said. No," said Martha, sitting up on her heels among her black lead brushes. "Not of the sort." "What does that mean?" asked Mary seriously. In India, the natives spoke different dialects which only a few people understood, so she was not surprised when Martha used words she did not know. Martha laughed as she had done the first morning. "There now," she said. "I've talked broad Yorkshire again like Mrs. Medlock said I mustn't. Not of the sort means nothing of the sort. Slowly and carefully, but it takes so long to say it. Yorkshire's the sunniest place on earth when it's sunny. I told you that I'd like the moor after a bit. Just wait till you see the gold-coloured gorse blossoms and the blossoms of the broom and the heather flowering. All purple bells, and hundreds of butterflies fluttering, and bees humming, and skylarks soaring up and singing. You'll want to get out on it at sunrise and live out on it all day like Dixon does." "Could I ever get there?" asked Mary wistfully, looking through her window at the far-off blue. It was so new and big and wonderful, and such a heavenly colour. "I don't know," answered Martha. "Thou's never used the legs since they was born, it seems to me. They couldn't walk 5 mile. It's 5 mile to our cottage." "I should like to see your cottage." Martha stared at her a moment curiously before she took up a polishing brush again and began to rub the grate. She was thinking that the small plain face did not look quite as sour at this moment as it had done the first morning she saw it. It looked just a trifle like little Susan Ann's when she wanted something very much. "I'll ask my mother about it," she said. "She's one of them that nearly always sees a way to do things. It's my day out today and I'm going home. I'm glad. Mrs. Medlock thinks a lot of Mother. Perhaps she could talk to her." "I like your mother," said Mary. "I should think they did," agreed Martha, polishing away. "I've never seen her," said Mary. "No, there hasn't," replied Martha. She sat up on her heels again and rubbed the end of her nose with the back of her hand, as if puzzled for a moment. But she ended quite positively. "Well, she's that sensible and hard-working and good-natured and clean that no one could help liking her, whether they'd seen her or not. When I'm going home to her on my day, I just jump for joy when I'm crossing the moor. I like Dixon, added Mary, and I've never seen him. Well, said Martha stoutly, I've told you that the very birds like him, and the habits and wild sheep and ponies and the foxes themselves. I wonder, staring at her reflectively, what Dixon would think of thee. He wouldn't like me, said Mary, in a stiff, cold little way. No one does. Martha looked reflective again. How does they like the cell? She inquired, really quite as if she were curious to know. Mary hesitated a moment and thought it over. Not at all, really, she answered, but I never thought of that before. Martha grinned a little, as if at some homely recollection. Mother said that to me once, she said. She was at a washtub, and I was in a bad temper and talking ill of folk. And she turns round on me and says, "Thou young vixen, thou. There you stand, saying that doesn't like this one and that doesn't like that one. How does they like thyself?" It made me laugh, and it brought me back to my senses in a minute. She went away in high spirits as soon as she had given Mary her breakfast. She was going to walk 5 miles across the moor to the cottage, and she was going to help her mother with the washing and do the week's baking and enjoy herself thoroughly. Mary felt lonelier than ever when she knew she was no longer in the house. She went out into the garden as quickly as possible, and the first thing she did was to run around and round the fountain flower garden 10 times. She counted the times carefully, and when she had finished, she felt in better spirits. The sunshine made the whole place look different. The high, deep blue sky arched over Misselthwaite, as well as over the moor, and she kept lifting her face and looking up into it, trying to imagine what it would be like to lie down on one of the little snow-white clouds and float about. She went into the first kitchen garden and found Ben Weatherstaff working there with 2 other gardeners. The change in the weather seemed to have done him good. He spoke to her of his own accord. "Springtime's coming," he said. "Cannot thou smell it?" Mary sniffed and thought she could. "I smell something nice and fresh and damp," she said. "That's the good rich earth," he answered, digging away. "It's in a good humour, making ready to grow things. It's glad when planting time comes. It's dull in the winter where it's got naught to do. In the flower gardens out there, things will be stirring down below in the dark. The sun's warming 'em. You'll see bits of green sparks sticking out the black earth after a bit." "What will they be?" asked Mary. "Crocuses and snowdrops and daffodillies. Has thou ever seen them?" "No. Everything is hot and wet and green after the rains in India," said Mary. "And I think things grow up in a night." "These won't grow up in a night," said Weatherstaff. "They'll have to wait for 'em. They'll poke up a bit higher here and push out a spark more there, and uncurl a leaf this day and another that. You watch 'em." "I'm going to," answered Mary. Very soon she heard the soft rustling flight of wings again, and she knew at once that the robin had come again. He was very pert and lively, and hopped about so close to her feet, and put his head on one side and looked at her so slyly that she asked Ben Weatherstaff a question. "Do you think he remembers me?" she said. "Remembers thee?" said Weatherstaff indignantly. "He knows every cabbage stump in the gardens, let alone the people. He's never seen a little wench here before, and he's bent on finding out all about thee. There's no need to try to hide anything from him." "Are things stirring down below in the dark in that garden where he lives?" Mary inquired. "What garden?" grunted Weatherstaff, becoming surly again. "The one where the old rose trees are." She could not help asking because she wanted so much to know. Are all the flowers dead, or do some of them come again in summer? Are there ever any roses? "Ask him," said Ben Weatherstaff, hunching his shoulders towards the robin. "He's the only one as knows. No one else has been inside it for 10 years. 10 years was a long time, Mary thought. She had been born 10 years ago. She walked away, slowly thinking. She had begun to like the garden just as she had begun to like the robin and Dixon and Martha's mother. She was beginning to like Martha too. That seemed a good many people to like, when you were not used to liking. She thought of the robin as one of the people. She went to her walk outside the long ivy-covered wall over which she could see the treetops, and the second time she walked up and down, the most interesting and exciting thing happened to her. And it was all through Ben Weatherstaff's robin. She heard a chirp and a twitter, and when she looked at the bare flower bed at her left side, there he was hopping about and pretending to peck things out of the earth, to persuade her that he had not followed her. But she knew he had followed her, and the surprise so filled her with delight that she almost trembled a little. "You do remember me," she cried out. "You do. You are prettier than anything else in the world." She chirped and talked and coaxed, and he hopped and flirted his tail and twittered. It was as if he was talking. His red waistcoat was like satin, and he puffed his tiny breast out and was so fine and so grand and so pretty that it was really as if he was showing her how important and like a human person a robin could be. Mistress Mary forgot that she had ever been contrary in her life, when he allowed her to draw closer and closer to him, and bend down and talk to him and try to make something like robin sounds. Oh, to think that he should actually let her come as near to him as that. He knew nothing in the world would make her put out her hand toward him or startle him in the least tiniest way. He knew it because he was a real person, only nicer than any other person in the world. She was so happy that she scarcely dared to breathe. The flower bed was not quite bare. It was bare of flowers because the perennial plants had been cut down for their winter rest. But there were tall shrubs and low ones which grew together at the back of the bed. And as the robin hopped about under them, she saw him hop over a small pile of freshly turned up earth. He stopped on it to look for a worm. The earth had been turned up because a dog had been trying to dig up a mole, and he had scratched quite a deep hole. She looked at it, not really knowing why the hole was there. And as she looked, she saw something almost buried in the newly turned soil. It was something like a ring of rusty iron or brass, and when the robin flew up into a nearby tree, she put out her hand and picked the ring up. It was more than a ring, however. It was an old key which looked as if it had been buried a long time. Mistress Mary stood up and looked at it with an almost frightened face as it hung from her finger. "Perhaps it has been buried for 10 years, she said in a whisper. "Perhaps it is the key to the garden." And the end of this chapter seems like a good place to call it a night. If you would like to pick up where you've left off, as usual, you can find The Secret Garden on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepytimetales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. A reminder that the music for tonight is Sweet Night and Friends by Kumiko. Check out more of their work on their website, which you'll find linked in the show notes. Good night, and sweet dreams.